A phone vibrated on a mahogany desk, and Marcelo's thumb reached for it before his mind had time to register what the notification would be. The thumbnail preview was a smear of motion and a single caption. Heartbreaking video, elderly couple selling sweets at dawn. He opened it, expecting the usual, some curated sorrow made for shares, but the first frame stopped him, as if the world had pressed pause. A shaky hand extended a small paper cone of brigadeiros toward the camera. The camera wavered, catching a face in the background. Wrinkled eyes, the soft slope of a familiar jawline, a headscarf folded the way his mother always tied hers. Marcelo's mouth went dry. He had memorized that profile in a dozen different lightings, in the glow of their tiny kitchen, under cheap birthday candles, beside a chipped photograph of a boy in a cardboard graduation cap. The woman in the video steadied the tray with the other hand, and when she smiled without letting the weight of the morning show. Something he had kept buried for 10 years shifted like a cracked glass. He remembered the tray in a different setting, not the street, not the church, but a marble hallway with a cousin's laughter echoing off chandeliers and a servant's uniform that used to be normal to him but suddenly felt years away. He remembered a door shutting behind his own footsteps, the sound of his father's shoes as he left the house for the city where he would make the life he had promised to make. He remembered, with a clarity that tugged at his throat, an argument that had flattened like a newspaper, a sentence he had flung at them in anger and youthful cruelty. Words he had used to carve distance until there was no easy path back. He watched the rest of the clip. The camera woman, someone from the neighborhood, panned the couple carefully, as if they were artifacts found by the curb. The comments scrolled by. Has anyone called social services? This is how our elders are treated. One commenter recognized the church behind them. Another tagged a local radio host. In less than an hour, the video had 100,000 views. Marcelo felt the view count like a physical thing pressing against his ribs. He closed the phone and stood. He moved through his penthouse with the practiced, deliberate pace of a man used to making decisions that changed ledgers and media cycles. But this was not a spreadsheet problem. The office smelled faintly of espresso and new leather. His reflection in the window showed a man whose suits were tailored to hold confidence. Under that polished armor, something old and sharp trembled. 10 years ago, he had left. He had said then that he couldn't drag them into the fallow years before success. He had convinced himself he was saving them a humiliation that only success could erase. In those same years, he had built a company and a life measured by boardrooms and runway lights. He had convinced himself, with the ease of rationalization, that absence was protection. Find them, he told Helena. Helena read him the way she read his calendar, every hole, every margin. She had been with him from the days when his shirt still had the occasional missing button and a fridge with 3 condiments. She had grown into a woman who knew every eccentricity of his brand and the exact tone that calmed his temper. Today, she was quiet in the way someone who has kept a file of people's lives for years can be. Understanding the file is suddenly taboo. Within the hour, she had a list: the church, a neighbor named Sandra with a loud voice but a soft phone, an address, 2 bus routes, and 15 minutes of walking from the center. She brought him a map with annotations, a timestamp from the original upload, and a printed copy of the comments. On the bottom of the page, in Helena's neat script, a single line read, "They sell at dawn, first light. Ask for Dona Esperanza." Marcelo had not intended to go himself. The business of reparation, he imagined at first, could be compartmentalized, delegated in the way he delegated problems. But the image of his mother's hands, working under another sky, would not be outsourced. There was pride in the motion of those hands. There was also a quiet resignation he had never wanted to see. On the ride to the neighborhood, the city seemed to change scale. Towers receded, giving way to houses with iron gates and tiled porches. The car radio, which usually played the hum of financial news, was switched off. Marcelo watched the world pass in slow slices through the tinted glass, thought of the envelope he had left on their table 10 years ago, an envelope he thought he had delivered and had never been sure if they'd opened, and realized how thin the line had been between presence and disappearance. She sold them under a small awning in the shadow of a church whose bells were not yet loud. The morning was awash of incense memory and the first birds. A wooden table, one folding chair, 2 thermoses, and a tray of brigadeiros whose chocolate skin gleamed under the light. The smell hit him even from the end of the alley. Sweet condensed milk and cocoa, fried sugar, and the faint citrus of cheap orange peel. The sight of the brigadeiros, the same small, perfect domes he had once eaten in the dim kitchen of their old house, made something inside him fold. He stood at the alley's mouth and watched without being seen. Esperanza was smaller than the memory, but steadier. Her hands were worn into ridges like well-used tools and moved with care. She placed each brigadeiro into a paper cone and handed it over to those who passed, nodding and exchanging a few words. A neighbor, Sandra, the woman Helena had mentioned, who still had a laugh that filled space, approached and dropped 2 bills into the paper cone as if paying off an old debt she felt she had to the past. "For you to keep," Sandra insisted, but Esperanza refused. "It's for who needs eating," Esperanza said, voice soft but firm. "I don't want charity." They knew him was the word she said when someone asked where her boy was. He is somewhere to do good. She invented stories for neighbors, as if protection could be sculpted from narratives. When a teenager recognized the name and whispered about the man who had left home to win cities and then forgotten, she shrugged and smiled. Marcelo pressed his palm against the cool brick and let the air go out of him in a long, slow breath. He had thought he'd come to confront them with currency and apology. What he had not anticipated was how the sight of his mother's dignity would rearrange his intent. She refused the crate of ready-made pity at first glance, the volunteer who offered a prepackaged food box, the council worker with his clipboard. She refused a soup kitchen line that would have put labels on them. Her pride was not stubbornness. It was a shape of love she had learned to carry so it would not break her children. There was a line between gratitude and humiliation, and she walked it with the ease of someone who had practiced for years. He watched his father then, Joaquim, arrive with a slow gait, as if the years had softened him. He wore his best Sunday shirt, pressed enough to be noticed, but not enough to be showy. Joaquim moved in a way that spoke of steady labor, a man comfortable with his hands and his silence. He carried 2 metal cups of coffee in a thermos, enough for himself and the woman he had walked through life beside. When his eyes landed on the boy he had raised, something like a tidal beat passed over his face and then settled. Marcelo had rehearsed 100 things to say: anger, accusation, pleading, the carefully measured remorse that money will sometimes smooth. None of them felt right when he finally stepped forward. He moved quietly, the way you approach something fragile and familiar, and worry you might break it by your mere presence. She looked up, and for a moment, there was an unspoken inventory. Years of pride, a memory of a slammed door, the envelope. Then Esperanza's smile softened into that particular private expression she kept for family, an expression that had never once asked anything in return. It unsettled him. He had imagined her with resentful fingers, folding old hurt into small, manageable parcels to be opened only if he asked. Instead, she continued working, eyes steady. "We have fresh ones," she said to a woman at the table as if announcing prices. "You shouldn't be here," Marcelo heard himself say. She paused, as if to consider whether he spoke to the person who had once left or the stranger who had finally returned. "This place feeds people," she said. "It gives something besides pity." Her hands never stopped moving. She wrapped another sweet, took the money, folded it with the same careful movements she reserved for bills that mattered. "You don't have to explain," he began, and the words came out more like an accusation than a confession. He watched her face change through a narrow spectrum, curiosity, then a small concern. "Explain what, Filio?" she asked. The way she said the word, son, was the same way she always had. The syllable contained such love, it made him ache. He was 37 and had built skyscrapers with investors' names and stock tickers. Yet one word from his mother could reduce that architecture to a pile of something small and private. "They said you were—" He faltered because the sentence felt cheap to finish. He had no right to call it out with the cruelty of second-hand headlines. "They said you were selling." He meant to say for charity. He meant to say because you needed money. He could not make his shame soft enough to place beside her dignity. Esperanza folded another brigadeiro and offered it. "People need sweets," she said simply, "and sometimes people need to be remembered." She did not ask whether he had money. She did not ask whether he regretted. Her posture was shaped by a life that took care of things that could be mended at home. He watched her refuse a hand extended with a pamphlet about government aid. "No," she said gently. "We are not a case." The urge to talk through the decades swelled in him like a tide. He wanted to explain himself, to list the deals and flights and the calendar of escapes that he had piled between them. Instead, he remembered the envelope, the one he had thought to have left on the kitchen table, the one with clean, clumsy handwriting. "I need time," it read in his head, though the actual words he had put there were a catalogue of aspirations and instructions. He could not remember if he had signed it in anger or fear. Behind them, a neighbor who had seen the video, Sandra, stood with her phone in hand and a look that oscillated between curiosity and practical kindness. She was the kind of person who hammered small injustices into the concrete of communal conscience. Her face betrayed an idea forming, one that flickered between helping and spectacle. Marcelo wanted to hug his mother and tell her he was sorry in a way that would erase the years, but the shape of him was not the boy she had once folded into her apron. He reached instead for a line of logic. "Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you call?" Esperanza's hand stilled. The movement of her life, wrapping, folding, exchanging, held still in that breath. She smiled, tender and bright, as if unlocking a quiet memory. "We wrote," she said. "We wrote more than once." He heard something drop inside him. The word letters, letters, sounded stupidly final, like an old doorbell. He imagined envelopes stacked on a shelf, stamps curling, ink fading into the fibers of time. He pictured a mailman's route, a bundle of drafts bereft of closure. "You didn't get them?" Esperanza asked, a knowledge that was both patient and incredulous at once. He could feel the answer pushing against the back of his teeth. No, he never did. But he also remembered the time he had asked his assistant to keep correspondence that he feared would distract him, the same Helena whose neat script now labeled his map. He had been loud in his loneliness then, telling the world he needed space to build. Somewhere in the space he had left a campaign of silence and, perhaps, instruments that enforced it. "Helena," he said into the alley, like a truce offering. Helena came forward with the mechanical precision of someone who knows they are about to read a report that will change the table. She did not look like a woman who had one more secret to give. She looked like someone prepared to hand over a truth that had been waiting in a drawer. "I'm sorry," she said before he could start. The words were small, threaded through with something like shame. "The letters. Some of them never left my desk. There was a batch I thought was for later, and then—" Her voice collapsed. She had spent years as his steward of daily life. Admitting a lapse felt like admitting betrayal. Esperanza's eyes softened into 100 small griefs. She didn't demand reasons. She only set another sweet into a paper cone and offered it to a child who wandered by, and in doing so taught him that the world did not stop for explanations. Helena held out an envelope with his name in his handwriting, creased by a life it had never touched. Marcelo took it as if he were picking up a relic. When he, finally, hurriedly, broke the seal, the pages inside were a map of a man in transit. Apologies disguised as schedules, promises masquerading as resolutions. There were brief, clumsy sentences about not wanting to be a burden, about needing time to make something of myself. Then, somewhere amid the practicalities, the true confession he had never allowed to be spoken. An admission of fear disguised as an order. He had asked them, he had told them, "Don't come. Wait until I have done it. Wait until I've made something we can all be proud of." The ink had been bolder than the feeling that spawned it, and it had done the clever work of shutting a door. Esperanza had kept the letters. She had written back in careful, loving replies he had never read. She had folded them into a box and placed them against the back of a closet where the light of the mailbox never found them. She had made the choice not to insist. She had let his need for distance be a kind of sacrifice she could live with. That choice, his choice, their consent to his absence, settled on him like a new garment, too tight and unyielding. He felt anger, not at them, but at himself, at the ease with which explosive words had been used to obliterate a conversation, at the way he had imagined himself the center of the universe and built a life that avoided the messy orbit of belonging. The letters were a ledger that refused to balance. They said in soft strokes that they had not abandoned him. They had obeyed his request. "You asked us to leave," Esperanza said simply. The statement was not a rebuke. It was not an accusation. It was, as ever, an inventory of facts. She had always been someone who listed what was and then moved on. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. The sentence fell apart amid all the noise in his head. "Protecting by erasing?" Joaquim's voice rumbled from behind them. He had been quiet until now, as comfortable in the background as a good table leg. He set down his thermos and joined them. "We raised you to fly," he said, looking at his son, "not to make us disappear." Helena had tears at the corner of her eyes. She had been the custodian who had misplaced not only envelopes, but a chance for immediate reconciliation. She had been terrified of the whip of his anger years ago and had made decisions in the shadow of that fear. Now she lived with the knowledge of the consequences. "I should have delivered them," she whispered. "I thought there would be time." Time had been a negotiator who never sat at a table with them. It had made treaties with absence and kept its terms. Marcelo folded the letters back into their envelope and felt each crease as a reprimand. His hands trembled, but he was grateful the tremor was not visible. He wanted to say something that would loosen 10 years like a knot. He wanted to gather them and put them back into the life he had left. Instead, he realized he had already been witnessed by a crowd that would soon demand a narrative. Sandra, who had seen the original video, had a way of turning private misfortunes into community action. She stepped forward, her phone held up as if the moment might be captured and preserved. "People will want to hear this," she said, with the honest bluntness of someone who wrote op-eds with her morning coffee. "They'll say things, but maybe they'll help." There was a part of Marcelo that wanted to flee, yet another instinct formed of 1,000 business escapes. He had hidden from headlines before. He had engineered stories to his favor and smoothed edges internationally. But the camera his neighbor offered did something else. It held a promise to him, not to the world. He could use the light not to light himself, but to illuminate what he had broken. The temptation to make reparation public was alive and dangerous. "I don't want to be a spectacle," Esperanza said quietly, and it felt like a dam setting its terms. Her voice carried the calm of someone who had learned the limits of what could be fixed with strangers' applause. She would not allow herself to be put on a stage for pity, but she would not refuse help either. In the pause, Marcelo's face reshaped into an expression he hadn't worn for years, one that mixed shame and something like determination. He found his voice small and steady. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were small, but they landed like the first rains on cracked ground. "You don't have to say it for a camera," Esperanza replied. "You can say it at dinner." The comment made him laugh, a sound that cracked and reformed into something else. "Dinner?" he said. "The idea of family dinner, A thing he had once taken for granted seemed suddenly like the construction of a new building, possible if one had the right materials. Helena reached out and took his hand in a gesture that bridged years and roles. "We can start," she said. "We can begin somewhere." He looked at the tray of brigadeiros, and in its shine he saw more than a suite. He saw the kitchen of a life he had left with a slammed door and an envelope he had never meant to weaponize. He thought of the mansion where, years earlier, Esperanza had worked in a uniform that bore the civilities and humiliations of a world he now moved through. He remembered seeing his mother in that hall once, learning the unspoken codes of servitude that bend people into forms pleasing to the rich. The memory this time had weight, and in it a single image remained. Esperanza, holding a tarnished doorknob with a hand that did not tremble, even as laughter echoed through corridors that did not include her. A quick on-screen note that had been drafted earlier and now seemed necessary glowed across his mind like a legal asterisk. The story he was beginning to speak was a dramatized telling. The detail of Esperanza's work in the mansion had been introduced to sharpen the theme of restitution and reconciliation. It was not meant to shame anyone who worked there now, nor to glorify the purchase of property as revenge. It was a frame, a lens through which they might understand why a man would be driven to act. He had not planned to announce anything in that alley, yet the compulsion to repair was becoming a momentum of its own. He imagined buying back that memory, purchasing the place where his mother had been made small, not to place someone else beneath his heel, but to convert that floor into something that fed people and preserved dignity. The idea was dangerous. It required negotiation, restraint, and an earnest refusal to turn restitution into spectacle. "You hurt us," Joaquim said, not as blame, but as a simple ledger entry. "You took the world, and we kept the small things." "I thought I was saving you," Marcelo said again, because the words needed time to set. Esperanza wrapped a brigadeiro and placed it gently in Marcelo's hand, as if to remind him that small gestures are the beginning of repair. "Then start," she said. "Start by bringing yourself home." The air held between them, unfinished, charged. Marcelo felt the gravity of the moment pull him toward decisions that would outlast his apologies. The letters had been a bridge neglected for too long. Now, with their edges exposed, he knew the only way to cross was to walk it step by step. He left the alley with a handful of brigadeiros, and the image of his mother standing strong under the awning seared into his eyes. The city's rhythm returned around him, indifferent and bustling, but he moved differently through it now. He called a meeting. Helena was waiting with the small files. Sandra's number flashed on his screen. She had already sent a message to a radio host and a local reporter, the kind of practical mischief that would not let a story sleep. In his car, the brigadeiros smelled like everything he had missed. He thought about restitution that was more than monetary, a project that would honor dignity rather than spotlight pain. He thought about converting a memory into a resource. He thought about the mansion and the way a doorknob could be polished or replaced, about how a room that once witnessed humiliation could witness services, a community kitchen, counseling rooms, a place where people could learn trades and sit without being cataloged as pity cases. He turned the envelope over in his hand, reading his own handwriting as if it were a contract he had breached. The city looked different through the windshield, a theater of possible returns. Some decisions, once taken, gather speed like a stone rolling down a hill. Marcelo found himself making one then, quietly, privately, without cameras. He called his lawyer and asked for a search on the old mansion near the town where his mother had worked. He wanted to know who owned it, what it cost, and whether an honest, non-vengeful person could transform its purpose. As the car crossed bridges and neighborhoods folded into one another, his mind prepared speeches he had not yet earned. He rehearsed a single line over and over, not for the press, but to the people who mattered, to his parents, to Helena, to himself. He said it like a vow, not yet ready for public ears. "I'm back to save you." The words felt wrong and right at once. They were bold, they were messy, they were incomplete. They carried the hubris of a man who had believed money could close the space time had eaten, and the tenderness of a son who finally understood what home meant. He parked near his old neighborhood and sat for a while before stepping out. The sun was higher now, striking the world with a new clarity. He turned off his phone and walked toward the small house where his parents had always kept the kettle on, where the light in the window had once been everything. His steps were slow, steady as someone learning a language again. Inside, Esperanza wiped her hands on a clean towel and set the table with 2 small plates. Joaquim had lit a cheap candle, and the room smelled like coffee and the faint, unmistakable scent of home. The brigadeiros sat in a glass bowl between them, their glossy tops catching the candlelight. They all sat in that circle, and for the first time in a long time, Marcelo felt the edges of his achievements fall away, and what remained was a simple dinner: bread, a pot of beans, 2 cups of coffee. He watched his parents pass him a slice of cheese and felt the world reorder. The ache that had pushed him toward declarations and purchases softened into something practical and immediate. "I want to make something right," he said. The words were smaller than the vow he had whispered alone in his car, but they entered the room without fanfare. Not with headlines, with things that last. Esperanza nodded. No chest-thumping acceptance, no waving of flags. Her concession was a look, measured and heavy with the wisdom of someone who had known too many loud apologies. They spoke late into the afternoon. Joaquim's voice was steady, the kind of patience that had smoothed years of early morning rises and hard labor. He asked about intentions, timelines, about how Marcelo imagined rebuilding more than a house. He asked whether Marcelo understood the work of dignity, the long, slow work of creating a place where people could walk in with pride. Marcelo listened. He heard the questions as tests not of his wealth, but of his humility. When he left, he did not leave with a declaration to the press. He left with a plan sketched in his head. He would need lawyers, community leaders, time, and a patience that his younger self had never shown. He would have to convince his parents that the idea was not a theater of redemption for his ego, but a way to convert a painful past into a living, breathing commons. As Marcelo walked back through streets he once played in as a child, he caught sight of the mansion's silhouette, a grand, somber outline on a hill. Its windows blinked like eyes that had watched people move through decades. An old idea, once merely a memory, was now a project under construction in his mind. He opened his phone and typed a message to Helena that simply said, "Start looking, quietly, no cameras." He pressed send and felt the first real weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This was not about headlines. This was not about payback. It was about repairing a life he had damaged, piece by careful piece. The day closed around him with a soft hush. He walked into the high-rise where his office waited like an island. The elevator hummed. He watched himself reflected in the stainless steel walls and remembered a boy at a kitchen table, head bowed over homework while his mother stirred a pot beside him. He thought of the small brigadeiro he had been handed at a party years ago, the taste of condensed milk and cocoa, a sweetness that held, in a single bite, the shape of a family. When the elevator doors opened, his phone buzzed again. Another notification, another comment. The world wanted its version of the story. Marcelo let it wait. He had to decide what version of himself he wanted out there first. He walked into his office and sat at his desk, not to call a press conference or to tweet an apology, but to work on the quiet, messy logistics of making right. He opened a blank document and wrote, in letters large enough to see, the first sentence of his plan: purchase, renovate, repurpose. He found his mother's old recipe for brigadeiros in his memory, the way a book opens to the exact page you're looking for. He wrote down the ingredients, not for the press, but to remember the small things that would stitch them back together. Condensed milk, butter, cocoa, patience. The list was both literal and symbolic. Outside, the city continued to hum, a million lives folding in and out of each other. Inside, Marcelo sat with a bowl of sweets he had bought on the way home, the chocolate soft at the edges. He thought of how he would go about buying a mansion without performing a public spectacle. He thought of letters, lost and found, and how one misplaced envelope could reroute a life. Night came like a quiet hand. He read his own letter again, and then placed it back into its envelope, not to seal anything shut, but to keep it as a reminder of the promise that had been both cruelty and confession. The plan was not yet a public act. It was a private reckoning, taking the first sensible steps toward a reparative future. In the quiet, Marcelo repeated the line once more, this time to his own reflection, like an incantation. "I'm back to save you." The words felt less like a boast and more like an admission that he could no longer stand aside and watch what time had done to the people who had given him everything. He would have to reckon with the past, with Helena's mistake, with the pride that had kept his parents from asking for more than dignity. He would need to build slowly, and to listen more than he had in a decade. Somewhere across town, lights brightened in a small house as people prepared for bed. A kettle hissed. A simple lamp threw a circle of yellow onto a table where two hands, calloused and steady, folded napkins and set a small plate of sweets for a tomorrow they could not yet name. He signed the papers in a small conference room not made for dramas, only for legalities and briefcases. The owner of the mansion was a reluctant gray-haired woman who had inherited the house from a family line that no longer lived in it. She spoke with the weary politeness of someone who had seen properties treated like trophies and was tired of the stories they carried. There were lawyers, a broker who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, and a checklist that turned a human idea into boxes checked in ink. Marcelo listened as his counsel explained zoning and tax breaks and the careful strings that tied philanthropic purchases to public perception. He asked about how to donate, how to protect the staff they would hire from scandal, how to make sure the space would not become a stage. "We want the keys," he said simply, and then, softer, "We want this place to hold dignity." They negotiated with the same meticulous calm he used in business, but with a different currency: nights of sleep, the quiet certainty that this could hurt if done wrong. He told the woman owning the mansion that he wanted no spectacle, no hissing press release at midnight, no check presented on a velvet cushion. He told her he wanted a private handover so he could speak to the family alone first. She looked at him, assessing not his bank account, but his face, and then nodded. The deal would be done quietly, the legal papers signed in simple respect, the transaction rendered to paper and then to action. When he first walked through those doors, months later, he felt the weight of 10 years press against every cornice. The rooms were larger than memory required, their ceilings swallowing small apologies whole. Light came through tall windows and fell in patches on a floor that had not known many footsteps that bent to ordinary things like cooking or mending. The doorknob he touched was cooler than he expected. He had seen that metal in a flash once as a child, his mother's hands steadying the world, and now he turned it knowing he wanted to change what that handle had witnessed. He had made a choice to bring no cameras that day. The legal transfer was a quiet ceremony in an office off the main hall. The owner, the broker, his lawyer, and Helena were present. Sandra was not. She had been told the family's wish for privacy and had agreed, with the sort of practical optimism that made her a good neighbor. Joaquim and Esperanza arrived holding hands, hesitant and curious as two people stepping into a lake that might be too deep. They wore their everyday clothes, nothing prepared for spectacle. Marcelo kept his vow. He walked them through the rooms, not as a triumphant buyer, but as someone trying to understand how a house could be turned back into hospitality. He knelt in the kitchen and ran his fingers along counters that smelled faintly of dust and the ghost of other meals. He imagined the breath of the mansion softened by the sound of laughter, not mockery. A room given over to people learning a trade, to children in a literacy class, to a pantry that did not brand people as needy. He showed them his plans: a community kitchen, A training room for skills, a small residence wing for families in transition, office space for social workers, a module for mental health counseling, and a permanent small museum space that told stories of dignity and labor without shame. "This is not a museum to what hurt you," he said. "It should be a place where people can come to learn to stand, and a place where work is honored." Esperanza touched the museum plan with the tip of her finger and then recoiled as if that word, museum, might fossilize the moment. "Will people see it and pity us?" she asked quietly. "No," Marcelo answered. "They will see people making a life. They will see the kitchen smell of coffee and the sound of lessons being taught. They will see hands at work, not hands to be judged." Joachim listened, and then, with a simple practicality that was the steady bone of him, asked about jobs. "Will the people who work there have a living wage?" he said. "Will they be trained for real work after?" Marcelo met his father's eyes and felt a bolt of humility sharpen into resolve. "Yes," he said. "We'll hire trainers. We'll partner with local businesses. We'll make sure there's a path." There was a conversation about naming. He wanted to name the project something that honored the small thing that had started it, sweets as a symbol of care. But Joachim asked whether the name should be more than a confection. They settled together on the name Helena had suggested the night before. Brigadeiros do Coração, Brigadeiros of the Heart. It felt small and large at the same time, an invitation to gather, a statement that what they made by hand could be offered with pride. They began work slowly. The conversion of a mansion into a community center is not an act of violence or a single stroke. It is a long, dirty, lovely process. Walls came down in places, and new ones were built. A chef from a nearby culinary school volunteered to train people who had never thought of work as a craft. A retired carpenter offered weekend classes to teach furniture restoration. A counselor from a non-profit came once a week to speak with families. Marcelo paid with his money, certainly, but he also paid with the more fragile currency he had not practiced in years: patience. He sat in meetings where community members argued and helped them find common ground. He listened while plans were revised. He allowed for mistakes, apologized publicly when contractors overlooked historical details, and learned to accept critique with less defensiveness than his first companies had permitted. Helena worked as his liaison between the high-rise world and the small house where decisions meant the difference between dignity and spectacle. She learned to be humble in a new way, returning to the people whose lives her negligence had once altered, and asking, without flourish, for permission to help. She organized neighbors' committees and volunteers and taught Marcelo how to make a tray of brigadeiros in the early stages, his hands awkward between the spoon and the condensed milk. At first his brigadeiros were lopsided, but the residents laughed and taught him the right pressure to roll and the correct warmth of the pan, and those lessons softened him. They were careful about publicity. Sandra continued to stir interest in the neighborhood. She had a flair for timing and a moral certainty that sometimes made things happen. But every press invitation was screened by Joachim and Esperanza. They wanted the center to respect the privacy of people who came through its doors. When reporters asked for an exclusive, Marcelo declined. He did not want his parents' faces used to sell a narrative of redemption. When television crews arrived uninvited, security politely turned them away. Yet news travels. A small article in a local paper about a renovated mansion housing a community kitchen caught on. The story was framed as a human interest piece rather than a headline-grabbing rescue. People came, neighbors, civic leaders, even a few national journalists who wanted to understand why someone would purchase a house to give it away. Marcelo was careful with his words. At a small press conference where the chairs were filled with people who had come hoping to see something honest, he spoke plainly. "This is not about buying forgiveness," he said. "This is about making a place where people can stand. It's about work and dignity. My parents taught me that work is not shame. Work is the thing that shapes a life. If I have resources I can use to build that, I'm going to." He did not make grand promises. He spoke in specifics, The number of training seats the first year, the partnerships with job programs, the schedule of free meals to be served to families in need. He announced that the mansion would be open for community classes, including a small exhibit that told stories of domestic work and labor, curated with the input of current and former domestic workers. He insisted that the exhibit would not be a spectacle but a record, stories told by the people who lived them. When asked why he had chosen to take such a public stance, he said, "Because sometimes private repair becomes public good. If my mistake can be turned into a program that helps other families, then my apology has teeth." The day they opened Brigadeiros do Coração to the public, the sun carried a clean, forgiving light. The ribbon cutting was modest. A small table with 2 pairs of scissors, a plate of brigadeiros made by Esperança, and a crowd that included the neighbors who had for years queued at the church steps. The mayor arrived, his presence a token of official recognition, and a handful of civic leaders. But Joachim stood in the doorway, hands folded, unchanged in his dignity. Esperança moved through the room handing out sweets as if the ribbon had been cut only to bless her hands. Helena stood with Marcelo at the edge of the crowd and watched as the first trainee, an unemployed chef in his 30s named Renan, stepped forward to demonstrate the new line of community-made sweets. Renan's hands trembled a little as he shared the recipe he'd learned from the visiting chef. He had been hired as a trainee and was visibly proud. There were tears in the faces of some community members, but they were not tears of pity. They were tears at the sight of a place where people could come and be part of something lasting. The program grew slowly, as it should. Partners committed to job placements. A local technical school offered apprenticeships. A small microloan fund was created to help graduates start micro-businesses. Marcelo appointed an independent board that included community leaders, including Sandra, and a small cohort of people who had experienced domestic work themselves. Esperança agreed to be a symbolic director of culinary traditions. She taught classes on sweets and home-style cooking, and she refused to be on television for interviews. She allowed only community sessions where people could come and learn and leave without being photographed if they wished. Joachim insisted on a practical role, overseeing maintenance and instructing a weekend workshop on practical trades. People began to call the mansion a model, not because of the money behind it, though the money was necessary, but because of the way the project centered people's dignity. Men who had once been embarrassed to say they'd done domestic work told guests that they had learned how to do plumbing or carpentry at Brigadeiros do Coração and had found steady work. A woman who had taught sewing in a cramped living room now ran classes for 20 people at once. The training focused on employability, but also on respect. How to bargain for fair pay, how to register as a small enterprise, how to manage finances. The museum room opened as a space for oral histories. It could have been a sad archive, but instead it was a talk room where voices were archived and honored. People held listening sessions there every Thursday. The story spread beyond the town. Other cities called to ask how they could replicate the approach. Marcelo began to speak in modest panels about the practicalities of social enterprise. He emphasized relationships over flashy campaigns. He would sometimes say, in front of audiences that wanted the drama rather than the work, "Restitution is not headline work. It is patient work." People liked the phrase. They also liked to ask about the line in his first vow, "I'm back to save you." He had said it alone once in his car, but it slowly became part of his public vocabulary, softened and reworked. "I'm back to stand with you." In interviews, he corrected himself when he heard the old hubris. It was not saving, but standing in solidarity that mattered. There were setbacks. An initial funding round did not come through, and a pantry had to ration. A contractor was accused of trying to underpay workers, and Jean, the renovation forewoman, demanded a meeting. Marcelo sat in a circle and listened as people voiced grievances. He learned to tolerate anger without shrinking. He learned that accountability is not an obstacle to love, but the scaffolding of it. Helena organized a committee of residents to audit the books. The transparency reassured people in a way a press release never would. One moment stood out. a day when a class of teenagers from a nearby school walked through the mansion on a field trip. They clustered in the exhibit room and listened as Esperanza told them, without dramatic flourish, about the day she had been belittled in a setting that had once made her small. She did not point fingers. She held a small, tarnished doorknob in her hand and let the kids feel its cool metal. "This door taught me how to hold my head up," she said. "Not because I had to, but because I wanted to, because my hands knew how to work, because my work meant something." The teenagers, some of whom had never seen a kitchen like that before, filed out differently, less entitled, more curious. A few of them signed up for the culinary program within weeks. There was a time when Marcelo had imagined that buying the mansion would be the symbol and that the symbol would be enough. He learned, painfully, that symbols mean nothing without the structures that support them. He worked to fund scholarships and hire trainers, to build partnerships so that the trainees had places to go once they left. He met with civic organizations to create a micro-enterprise ecosystem where products from Brigadeiros do Coração, cakes, breads, restored furniture, could be sold in local markets without intermediaries who took the lion's share. Brigadeiros do Coração became a small social enterprise with a bakery that supplied neighborhood cafes, a woodworking shop that sold pieces to a cooperative, and a counseling center run by trained volunteers. Families who had once slept in cramped apartments found transitional housing for a season. The center did not solve all social problems. It could not. But it was a place where people could retrain and re-enter the world with dignity, and where the narrative that had once been about shame was retooled into something generous. The movement's name began to carry a quiet portability. Other towns opened small pilot programs and called them by the same name. A non-profit network emerged that shared curricula, legal templates, and cautionary stories about what not to do. Marcelo contributed funds and lessons learned. His role changed from sole decision-maker to a funder and a listener, someone who could step back and let others take the lead. The day the local government granted Esperanza and Joaquim a civic medal, Marcelo sat in the second row with a small, private relief. The mayor gave a speech that called their story an example of community resilience and the power of individual choice. Joaquim accepted the medal with a hand more accustomed to work than to accolades, and then, in the quiet after the applause, took Marcelo's hand. The press crowd had been kept small at the request of the family. Photographs were taken with consent. A few weeks later, the mayor declared a local day of service, named informally by residents as Heart Day, to celebrate community labor and generosity. The declaration was symbolic, a plaque, an official mention. Marcelo watched as Esperanza refused a televised interview, but allowed a small segment where she taught children to make brigadeiros for a community table. Joaquim was photographed fixing a chair in the workshop, his hands steady and practical as ever. The image that circulated was ordinary and human. A woman in an apron laughing as chocolate smeared on her finger, a man with a dusting of sawdust on his shirt. The photos were circulated not as a spectacle, but as a gesture. People recognized something true and modest and wanted to share it. The family did not become a public exhibit. They remained private in their humility. Friends came by. The old house, now a modest bungalow where Joaquim and Esperanza lived a few streets from the mansion, was visited by trainees who came to learn, and sometimes by strangers who arrived with gifts of gratitude. They were given the space to be ordinary people in an extraordinary story. There was one public moment that mattered for the way Marcelo had been. A national talk program invited him to explain the project. The interviewer pressed for a soundbite, something viral he could offer. Marcelo thought of the envelope he had left on the table 10 years prior and of the hands that had kept it. He decided not to craft a slogan that turned grief profitable. Instead, he spoke plainly of mistakes and of the tedious work that followed. "Money will not buy love back," he said, "but it can buy a place where people heal. If you use it to listen, not to be seen, it can be part of repair." He kept repeating a line over and over again until it transformed from ego into covenant. I'm back to save you. In public he explained it differently now. I'm back to stand with you. The media wanted the former. The family insisted on the latter. Over time, the second phrasing stuck. Years passed, and the center matured. It developed a small fellowship program that trained new community leaders, a microloan facility for graduates, and partnerships with technical schools to provide certification. Economists noted the modest decrease in local unemployment. Sociologists studied the effect of dignity-based programs on recidivism and community cohesion. None of that mattered as much as the small, private things. A mother who had job training writing an invoice for the first time and feeling something like power. A teenage boy who learned to bake and found steadiness in a morning routine. An older woman who once had been a domestic worker, now curating oral histories. One afternoon, several years later, the family gathered on the same small table where they had shared that first meal. The house had been painted with fresh color, and the bowl of brigadeiros sat in the middle, now a ritual more than a remedy. Renan, the chef who had become the bakery manager, had dropped by to bring a new recipe, a slight variation on the old sweet. He sat back and watched the four of them, Marcelo, Esperanza, Joaquim, Helena, talk as if the years were beads they could rearrange without losing form. "Do you ever hear from people who say you were dramatic?" Marcelo asked quietly, partly teasing, partly curious. He had grown used to being asked to explain himself by strangers. Esperanza answered him in the voice that had steadied him years before. "People will always want to write a story for themselves," she said. "But what matters is how you carry your life when the crowd goes away." Joaquim added, with the simplicity that cushioned everything, "You did not save us. You offered a chance for others to stand." Marcelo thought of how small aggressive apologies can be, how easy it is to try to correct everything with a check. He had learned the long, slow grammar of repair, presence, humility, work, and the willingness to be corrected. He had also learned that people can surprise you with forgiveness when it is asked for in humility, and that forgiveness is not the same as erasure. Helena cleared her throat, and then, with a smile that smelled of reconnection, said, "You learned to make them better." Marcelo laughed. "I still need lessons." They ate those brigadeiros slowly, like a sacred ordinance of ordinary life. Each bite tasted of milk and cocoa and the labor of those who made them, and it tasted of time. Outside, the mansion hummed with life. Aromas of baking wafted down the street, and a class of young women prepared sandwiches for an evening food program. A small garden installed in the back produced herbs and vegetables used in the kitchen. The Museum of Work hosted listening circles. The workshop built small tables that would become the first product line for a cooperative. Children ran past with aprons tied around them like capes. The movement had ripples. A mayor in another region wrote to ask for guidance. A small foundation reached out to fund a scholarship for trainees. A documentary filmmaker requested access to the oral history archive, wanting to tell stories of laborers whose voices would otherwise not be recorded. Marcelo said yes sometimes and no other times. The rule became simple. Always ask the people whose stories were told whether they wanted to be part of the telling. There were nights when Marcelo would sit on the mansion's back steps and think about the letters again. He still kept the original envelope in a small box in his study, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. He had moved from the high-rise to a quieter office when he resigned from his executive role to devote more time to social projects. He still loved his work in measured ways. He still took calls that mattered. But his life had rerouted toward a quieter, honest center. One evening, as a low sun turned the mansion's facade gold, a small ceremony took place that had been requested quietly by people at the center. An anniversary of the opening. It was not a spectacle, no red carpets, but neighbors came with dishes and stories and a potluck of small, beautiful things. Sponsors were acknowledged in a modest program. A small plaque was affixed inside the entrance, not with names of donors, but with a phrase chosen by the residents. "This house remembers the work of our hands." Esperanza stood at the doorway and read the plaque aloud. Her voice did not tremble as it once might have. When she finished, a neighbor, a woman who had once offered her a bill in the alley and been refused, stepped forward and hugged her. She whispered something that made Esperanza laugh, and the laughter filled the garden. Marcelo found himself at the edge of the crowd and felt the shape of something like peace settle on him. He had not been the perfect son, he had been human, fallible. He had made mistakes, and he had been forgiven in small, stubborn ways. He had also made a choice to act, and the action had been messy and slow and beautiful. There was one last public recognition that arrived not as a fanfare, but as a quiet measure of how the movement had altered a community's life. The civil society network that had grown around Brigadeiros do Coração proposed a day to honor domestic work and community labor. It was adopted by a regional council and recognized in a modest proclamation that named the day Day of Labor and Dignity. Marcelo did not seek it. He accepted it with the same practical gratitude with which he had learned to accept everything else. The plaque for the day listed community initiatives like theirs, a way of making visible the invisible work that stitched neighborhoods together. That night, at the small table in the old house, Esperanza looked at her son. He had finished his plate, but he did not stand immediately. "Do you remember when you gave me that envelope?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes." "You were angry," she said. "I was," he admitted. "I thought distance was protection. I was wrong." She reached across the table and took his hand. The skin of her fingers was warm and had begun to show the soft evidence of age. "You came back," she said simply. He smiled, then became serious. "I am still trying to deserve it." "You don't have to deserve us," she replied. "You only have to be here. That is enough." After dessert and the clearing of plates, Marcelo stood on the porch and took out his phone. He scrolled for a moment, hesitated, and then typed a message to a number he had not called in years. It was short. "Hello, can we talk?" He did not send it immediately. He thought of the many people who had been part of his life, friends, relatives, old partners, who had been left behind by a younger, busier man. He thought of all the small, unpaid debts that quietly hold memory hostage. Then he hit send. Before he closed his phone, he hesitated and then drafted a short note that would be shared with viewers. "If you have someone you haven't spoken to in years, call them now. Reconciliation doesn't wait." It was an invitation that asked for nothing but a phone call. He pressed send and felt the small, exacting warmth of remembering. In the quiet that followed, he walked down the path toward the mansion and paused at the doorknob. He turned it slowly and felt the cold give way to warmth under his palm. The house was not a trophy, and it never would be. It was a place stitched together by people who wanted to practice dignity. Inside, a class was finishing, a pastry tray was cooling on a counter, and the laughter of students drifted into the evening. When the camera crews came later, months and then years later, they were allowed to film in carefully arranged pieces, always with the consent of those who appeared. The story that was shown was not a single moment of redemption, but a series of small, deliberate acts. People teaching one another, a mother instructing a teenager how to stir condensed milk without burning it, a father teaching a young man to steady a chisel. The footage that people returned to most often was not Marcelo's speech, but the image of Esperanza handing a brigadeiro to a child, and the child's surprised, honest smile. If anything, the most replicated scene from the story was a quiet one. A photograph of the small bowl of brigadeiros on a modest table, the envelope from long ago beside it, and a small polished doorknob that had been placed on a shelf as a reminder. The caption read simply, "Work, love, repair." Years later, Marcelo would still sometimes wake at dawn and take a tray of sweets to the church down the street, not to sell, but to share. He would stand a short distance away and watch as people accepted them, refused them, or took one and kept walking. There were days when he thought his actions would be forgotten, and days when he worried that it had all been a performative arc. But what steadied him was the small work of showing up and listening. On a calm evening, the family gathered once more at their small table. A radio program had once again asked for a retrospective. Marcelo, cautious and changed, had declined the live broadcast, but had recorded a short message to be played that week. He listened to his own voice on the studio playback and then set the recorder down. He addressed the room, looking first to his mother. "We added a detail to our story," he said softly, and Esperanza arched an eyebrow in question. He smiled and turned to the camera of the small documentary crew present for archival reasons. "For narrative clarity, we told an adapted version of some moments to highlight the theme of restitution, the part about the mansion as a place where Esperanza once worked and was humiliated. That detail was used to explain why we felt driven to act. It is an adaptation to help people see the urgency of what dignity means. It is not a claim against any person who works there now." Esperanza nodded. The room felt safe enough for honesty. Marcelo continued, speaking to anyone who might hear. "Money didn't buy back time. Doing the work of repair did. Call someone. Tell them you're sorry if you are. Ask for forgiveness if you need it. And if you can, use what you have to build a place where people can stand." He put the recorder away, and they ate in silence for a while. The bowl of brigadeiros had been reduced. Night came, and the quiet was not empty but full of the sounds of a life remade, the distant clatter of dishes from the mansion, the murmur of people in mid-conversation, the soft hum of the city. Things did not ever become perfect. The center faced funding gaps, political shifts, and the ordinary wear of human institutions. But the small rituals remained. The Thursday oral histories, the Saturday apprenticeship program, the Tuesday meal for families. People learned that dignity is not an event, but a practice. Before he left the table that night, Marcelo reached across and took his mother's hand. He said, with a tenderness that had been shaped by years of practice, "Thank you for not making me a spectacle for your grief." Esperanza squeezed his hand and smiled. "You came home," she said, and in that small sentence he found all the repair he needed. If you are listening now and there is someone you have not spoken to in years, stop everything and call them. Don't wait for perfect words. Say hello, say you're sorry, say you're ready to listen. The rest can be built one small gesture at a time.